This video is going to cover solving a quadratic equation using the method called completing the square. So what is completing the square? So this is one way to solve a quadratic equation. What we're going to end up doing is making a perfect square on the left hand side with the x squared and x terms. And that's going to allow us to solve the equation using square roots. So let's take a look at an example here. Okay, so we have a quadratic here, x squared minus 2x minus 15 equals 0. Alright, so our first step with completing the square, I'm going to get the negative 15 to the other side of the equation. And to do that, I got to add 15, so that adds up to 0 there. Okay, after I add 15 to both sides, I get x squared minus 2x on the left hand side. And then on the right side, I just got 15. Okay, so here on the left hand side, I want to make this a perfect square. Okay, in order to do that, I take the coefficient of the x term. In this case, it's negative 2. I'm going to divide that by 2. And then I'm going to square the result. So negative 2 over 2 is negative 1. And then negative 1 squared just gives you positive 1. So I'm going to add that 1 to both sides. Alright, so now I got x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 16. Alright, so now on the left hand side, I can make this a perfect square. Okay, look at that. In order to do that, it's going to be x, and then it's going to be minus 1. Now it's minus 1 because if I were to square these out, x minus 1 times x minus 1, and if I do FOIL, I get x squared, x times x is x squared, x times negative 1 is negative 1x. That was this one times this one. And then negative 1 times x is another negative x. And negative 1 times negative 1 gives you positive 1. If I combine like terms, negative x minus x is negative 2x. So that's x squared minus 2x plus 1. Okay, so that makes it a perfect square here just by dividing the middle term, the x term by 2 and squaring it. And then when I make it into this, I have to look at C. It's basically going to be, our 1 here that we got. That's going to be, add it to be 2 of them to get the 2 x's and multiply together to give you the 1 in this spot. Alright, and then 16 comes down. Now with this being a square, I can take the square roots of both sides. Okay, the square root of x minus 1 squared just leaves you with x minus 1. Okay, and then the square root of 16, we know that 4 times 4 is 16, and negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. So it's going to be plus or minus 4. It's going to be either of those two answers. Now in order to solve, I use both of those answers. First I'm going to take x minus 1 equals positive 4. Okay, I'm going to solve that. I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So okay, x equals 5. Then I'm going to take another one, x minus 1 equals negative 4. I'm going to add 1 to both sides. That gives me x equals negative 3. So my two answers are x equals 5 and x equals negative 3. All right, so let's take a look at another example. All right, so here we have x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0. So again, I want to get the constant term to the other side. So I'm going to add 8 to both sides. Leaves me with x squared plus 2x equals 8. Again, I take the x coefficient, take that value, divide it by 2, and then square it. Again, I get 1 squared, just 1. Add 1 to both sides. Okay, to make this side a square, it's going to be x plus 1. Okay, so again, if I FOIL, I'll end up with x squared plus x plus x plus 1. And then combine like terms, get the 2x that's in the middle. And then the right side, that adds up to 9. And they're going to take the square root of both sides. Leaves me with x plus 1 here. And then plus or minus 3. Again, I take each of those answers, x plus 1 equals 3, and x plus 1 equals negative 3. Subtract 1 here, so x equals 2. Subtract 1 here, x equals negative 4. So my two answers are x equals 2 and x equals negative 4. Look at this example. We got x squared plus 7x minus 2 equals 0. Okay, again, I need to get that constant term to the other side. Okay, it leaves me with x squared. Leaves me with x squared plus 7x equals 2. Okay, then the next step is to take the x coefficient divided by 2 and square it. So 7 divided by 2, then square it. Okay, it's going to be 49. 7 times 7 is 49. And 2 times 2 is 4. So it gives me 49 fourths. I'm going to add that value to both sides. Okay, again, I need to make the left side a square. And what's this going to be? It's going to be 7 halves. The other side, I have 2 plus 49 fourths, so if I make them common denominators, I can add them a little bit more easier. So 4 would be the common denominator. 2, we can become 8 over 4, because 8 divided by 4 is 2. And then the 49 fourths, okay, which ends up giving you 57 fourths. Right, so then I'll just bring down this side. So the 7 halves, that's always going to be whatever your x term is divided by 2, because you need 2 of them. If I did, 7 halves x plus 7 halves x, that'll give me 14 halves or 7. So that's how we get that number. Just take the x coefficient and divided by 2, that's going to be, if you get two of those, add together, it's going to give you the middle term. Multiply those two together, that'll give you the 49/4. Alright, so from here, you can take the square root of both sides. So on the left-hand side, you get x plus 7/2. And then over here, you'll get plus or minus square root of 57/4. I'm just going to leave it as radical form. It could be a decimal, but for what we're going to do here, just going to leave it in square root form. Alright, now you want to get the x by itself. Here I'm going to subtract 7/2 from both sides. Alright, then you want to write it like this, negative 7/2 plus or minus square root of 57 divided by 4. Depending on the problem, if they need a decimal number for the answer, you would put this all into your calculator and get a decimal answer. Otherwise, you would leave it as this. Alright, so in this example, it's a little bit different. Now we have a value in front of the x squared. Okay, so it can be a little bit different way to solve this one. So here we got 4x squared minus 4x plus 15 equals 0. Now the first thing I want to do is move that 15 over. Okay, at least move 4x squared minus 4x equals negative 15. Okay, so from here I want to factor out the 4. So I factor out the 4, is you with 4 on the outside, x squared minus x on the inside. Bring everything else down. Now from there I can divide both sides by 4. Okay, from there I got x squared minus x equals negative 15/4. Alright, then again, I have a 1 as a coefficient, negative 1 divided by 2, and then square it. So it gives me 1 over 4, so 1/4. So I'm going to add 1/4 to both sides. So then over here on the left hand side, that ends up being x minus 1/2 squared. So 1/2 plus 1/2 gives you the 1 for the x term, and 1/2 times 1/2 gives you 1/4 for the constant term. And over here, negative 15/4 plus 1/4 gives you negative 14/4. And then from here, we take the square root of both sides. Okay, so I'm left with x minus 1/2 here. And then plus or minus the square root. I'm just going to reduce this negative 7/2, divide both of those by 2. Okay, and from there, I'm going to add half to both sides. So that ends up giving me x equals 1/2 plus or minus the square root of negative 7/2. Now, if you have a negative under a radical, we can't do a square root of negative number. So what we end up doing is turning that into an imaginary number. So basically 1/2 plus or minus square root of 7/2 I. And they use I to denote imaginary number. Okay, so your answer is going to be 1/2 plus or minus the square root of 7/2 I. Now in this example, we have x squared plus 4x plus 5 equals 0. Okay, so again, I want to get the constant term on the other side. So I'm going to subtract 5. Leaves me with x squared plus 4x equals -5. All right, I take the coefficient of the x term, which is 4 here, divided by 2, and then squared. So you always have to do this step. Take that the coefficient of the x term divided by 2, and then squared. Okay, 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared gives you 4. So I'm going to add 4 here. And you got to do the same thing to the other side. Add 4. Make that left-hand side a perfect square. So it's going to be x plus 2. Because 2 plus 2 gives you the 4. 4 to 4x. And 2 times 2 gives you the 4. That's in the constant place. And -5 plus 4 is -1. Then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. That leaves me with just x plus 2 on the left-hand side. And then square root of -1. So plus or minus square root of -1. And we just talked about it in the last problem. You can't take the square root of a negative number. So you end up changing that to 1i, or in this case just I. All right, so x plus 2 equals plus or minus I. And then I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. Leaves me with x equals -2 plus or minus I. And remember, I is an imaginary number. Since we can't take the square root of a negative number, we use the letter I to denote imaginary numbers. So square root of -4 will end up being that end up giving you 2i. Square root of -16 will give you 4i. So the square root of 16 is 4. The square root of -1 gives you the I. So that's how that works. So square root of -64. Square root of 64 is 8. And then the square root of the -1 gives you I. Alright, so I hope those examples of completing the square helped you out.